problems have arisen that people were waking me up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and they told me, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. There is no noise control, no noise ordinance in Neptune.
Yeah, I would suggest that's the sort of thing that you visit the town hall and make your feelings known to the governing body. I know that the municipal attorney will be only too happy to write up the ordinance.
I'm sure he would. Yeah. I'm sure he's been woken up at times, too.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Don't fool yourself that you're going to get an instant solution. It's one of the most difficult things to enforce in our society. Is even the best written noise ordinance is at best very difficult to sustain.
They usually deal, it's been my experience with our particular noise ordinance, with what's unreasonable, and that's a big catchword in the law.
Right.
What is and isn't reasonable, and that may or may not cover it.
Well, I would think a chainsaw going off at 6 o'clock in the morning is unreasonable.
Certainly is if it's near my house.
Okay,
We have three votes.
For somebody else at 1:30 in the morning.
We have three.
A big car with the horn going constantly.
Yeah. Well, we have 3 votes in here for the ordinance, so maybe you could tell the township attorney about that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night. In dealing with ordinances and disorderly persons offenses, and that's something we didn't even touch upon, whomever would like to, explain the different levels of law and when the prosecutor gets involved in that law.
Well, I'll start off, if you don't mind, Terry. That's another unique thing about New Jersey. When I go around and visit the district attorneys around the country, I find out that most of what they prosecute is drunk driving. And yet, county prosecutor in New Jersey doesn't touch a drunk driving case unless it's related to a death or an aggravated assault. There's certain levels. You have a violation of a municipal ordinance, which is something at the lowest level. For example, you sprinkled your lawn when they had a recent curfew on. Mm-hmm. You couldn't do that. That's something that would go before a municipal court and could have a penalty. He could imprison you, and he could fine you substantially. Your next level is disorderly persons offenses, which are neighborhood spats and dogs wandering onto somebody else's property, pushing, shoving, fighting that doesn't really involve any real injury to people. Again, municipal court, again, the judge has great latitude in how he handles those things, especially if they're neighborhood matters. He has a tremendous amount of latitude. You have your traffic offenses. Those things, again, are handled in municipal courts, and depending upon what you've done, there's a sliding scale of punishment, most of which is license revocation and fines. Drunk driving being the most serious one, however, though, does occasionally show up on the prosecutor's menu, because we start just above that. Mm-hmm. We deal with what they call actual crimes. The things I described before don't necessarily require a bad attitude or what the lawyers call a mens rea, an evil intent. If you're speeding, they don't care whether you really wanted to speed or you just sort of are absent-minded. But what we deal with, there has to be an evil intent, and normally there has to be fairly serious damage. And we have gradations too. I mean, they go from simple theft of property up to murder, sexual assault through domestic violence. Domestic violence is something that traditionally was handled on a local level up until about 5 years ago, and now is one of the biggest time occupiers that we have as prosecutors. In Monmouth County last year, we had over 4,100 men arrested for domestic violence. Each one of those cases was handled by my office, whereas before those things would have been done in the municipal courts. Now we do them. I'm sure Ocean is the same.
I will say that you're, in many aspects, way ahead of us. I've spoken to your people because we recently set up a unit similar to yours. We've made some major strides in the last year or so in changing things and making some additions, and I am familiar with your unit very intimately and know the volume of work that they do. And you're very right that things are changing drastically in the law today too.
Well, each time, every time we turn around, there's another law for you police officers to enforce, so that means there's another law for us to prosecute. When Terry was talking before, he mentioned he had 18 attorneys. I've got 31, and I'm in the process of hiring 4 or 5 more. When I took that job, I think I had 19, and that's only like 4.5 years ago. The things are just blossoming constantly. We just keep getting more and more and more. Not that we're less civilized or we're more crime-oriented. I just think that the legislature in some ways finding out that they're requiring us to do more things that traditionally weren't thought of as being so criminal, like domestic violence, for example, which admittedly is awful and we've got to do something about it. But it was never something that law enforcement got involved with before. It's something new.
So you're kind of widening your span of control, and then you can't help but have to put people in there to take care of the problem.
Absolutely.
I didn't know you had that many attorneys, but I know they're always busy.
They are busy.
Trying to get in touch with one.
Kevin, something that might be of interest to your viewers. The prosecutor indicated we have these different levels of offenses. We have first degree to fourth degree, the indictable matters that we handle, and then we have the disorderly and petty disorderly and municipal violations. One of the things, in keeping with the very strong powers of the prosecutors in New Jersey, we see in our offices every complaint that every individual or every police officer signs that would be a first to a fourth degree crime. It does not mean that we will prosecute that necessarily in the Superior Court. And the reason being, we have to be somewhat selective because we only have so many judges, so much court time, so much jail space, and we have to make decisions that are not always popular with the public. And I probably get, myself, as many questions from the public about what we call downgrading offenses as I do about any other single thing. And what happens there is that the prosecutor reviews the case in detail and makes an election that, for example, a bad check over $200 is technically a case that can be heard by a grand jury, presented to a petit jury in a trial that could take a day or two, and have a judge decide in the Superior Court what the sentencing is. If we did that on every bad check in Ocean County, and I'm certain the same is true of John in Monmouth County, that we took every $201 or maybe $500 or maybe $1,000 or $5,000 check and did that, we'd be doing nothing else. And we have to make an election very often that doesn't sit well with the public. And I have tried to at least make it clear to people who want to know the reasoning behind it, that we're there and we're willing to explain that, and I know John's office is the same way. It appears oftentimes to be a concern, but most of the time, I will say, when people do get an explanation, they understand why we're doing what we've done. Very often, they're better off as the complainant in a municipal court. Their case gets heard much quicker, their restitution is taken much quicker, the punishment is much swifter, and they're satisfied with the results that a municipal judge can give them maybe in a period of 30 days that we can't give them for 2 years in the Superior Court. And I think it's important for people to understand that prosecutors just don't downgrade cases because they have nothing else to do, and they think that's, you know, a way to unload things. They do it because we have to have certain priorities.
Very good. And to remind our viewers, our number here is 681-3330 if you'd like to call in and ask either of the prosecutors a question, and we have one call we'll take now. Good evening, you're on NJ Law. Could you give us your name and your question, please?
My name is Kathy Campanella. I'm from the Division of Youth and Family Services. I'm a child abuse investigator.
Hi.
And there's two things. I'd like to make one comment, and I have one question. I would just like to comment about the excellent relationship that the Division of Youth and Family Services has with the prosecutor's office in Monmouth County, and that Prosecutor Kaye is very influential in the child abuse task force here. And that I also know, because I've worked with Detective Quinn, that this is quite a targeted interest of his also. My question deals with the possible arrest and conviction of sexual abusers. It frustrates me when there is a 3 or 4-year-old, a very young child, that is interviewed by law enforcement, possibly the sex crimes unit at the prosecutor's office, and the child cannot make a good witness. So the case sometimes is not brought to the courts. Is there anything in future plans in either one of the counties that would possibly help this type of situation?
Maybe both gentlemen would want to comment
let
on
me
that.
try that. As a matter of fact, thank you for the compliment. I appreciate that. In fact, that's one of the things that I am certainly most proud of, is the effort that I've made in child abuse, that we've all made, but I've helped make some of it possible anyway. If anything, it's gotten harder. We have two real setbacks recently in our efforts to continue to use very young children as witnesses of child sexual abuse. Physical abuse, of course, is easy. You look at the bruises and, you can see that the child's been abused. That's the easy part. The sexual one is the difficult one because the child has to speak it. We had a case involving Judge John Rishardi, who was a resident of Wall Township. We had a small girl, she's like 4 years old. The child finished testifying. The child was very precocious, glib, was great, just great on the stand. At the conclusion of the child's testimony, the judge offered her an ice cream cone, thanking her for the work that she did. It was difficult. She was on the stand for a couple of days. The upper courts reversed that, saying that in a way it was a gratuity, or somehow he was forcing the child to say things which the child wouldn't have said but for the thought of getting an ice cream cone at the end of it. That case has never been retried because the people, the victims, were so distraught by what happened they wouldn't go through it again. And that whole idea of helping the child out with anything now is out of the law. The second part is that the U.S. Supreme Court has just recently prohibited us, and I think it applies to New Jersey, although there's an argument about it, from using closed-circuit television and videotape. Knowing what you do for a living, you realize that a lot of times these youthful victims cannot confront the adult who has victimized them. They're afraid, they're cowed. So what we do, we set up either a closed-circuit TV or a videotape so the lawyers can cross-examine. It's a very controlled atmosphere. The U.S. Supreme Court said you can't do that anymore. And that's going to be a problem, a real problem.
I agree with you completely. And I also agree that there have been great strides made in addition to the child abuse and sex abuse units at both of the counties. Have the victim witness coordinators have a great deal of influence in these type of cases. And influence may be not the proper word, a great deal to do with the cases, in that they're out there to provide services for the parents, for the infant victims. And it's something that I think every prosecutor in New Jersey can be very proud of, that we do have very, very active victim witness coordinators now. They're being trained in much more modern techniques today. The state Attorney General's office is very active in that regard, and it's not the horror and the terror it used to be, maybe just even a few years ago, for a victim in this type of situation to go to court. While we're having some legal drawbacks or setbacks, as Prosecutor Kaye just indicated, I think the whole system is becoming a lot less barbaric and a lot more victim-oriented.
Yeah, and one last thing, don't go away thinking that I'm putting a damper on this idea. We've experienced a few little setbacks, but I think that means we're just going to start doing our work a little better. We're going to come up with better techniques and different ways, and we will find a way around this, because responsible men and decent women aren't going to let this sort of stuff happen to kids, and we're committed to punishing people that are doing this sort of stuff and getting them away from other children. So we'll come up with something.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Kathy, DYFS is in a unique position to be able to speak to the victims, even sometimes when police officers can't. Isn't that true?
Yes.
Or I might have heard recently that there was a setback on that line with DYFS being considered maybe law enforcement officers.
They have to Mirandize now.
Now they have to Mirandize people. But you still have the right to speak to, and the times we've worked together, speak to victims, whether it be at the school or whatever, especially if it's a parental
Yeah.
type abuse situation where I might not be able to in the same manner. Do you find that that's a help in these type of cases? Or?
Oh, yes, there's no question, because lots of times, you know, when you go into a home with a police officer or you go into the home by yourself, the child is so intimidated they will not talk in front of the parents or, you know, the target there. And when you're able to catch them in school or a daycare center, there's so much you could get, you know, from them. And the prosecutor's office has been, you know, really a support in coming out with us when we've needed them. It's just been a very good working relationship. And, yeah, the job is very tough, as it is for you guys, too, and it does get very frustrating, but hopefully there will be strides made in the future.
Well, I appreciate your kind words, and hopefully we'll continue to have a good working relationship and probably improve it much more, especially by an open dialogue. And I think certainly one of the shows in the near future will deal with some of the agencies that we in the criminal justice system deal with outside of the enforcement community, so to speak. The Division of Youth and Family Services, for one, and some of the other agencies. So we'll look forward to that, and we'll discuss this further.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you. Good night. You mentioned, Mr. Farley, the Victim Witness Assistance Program, and I think there's a lot of people who are, through no fault of their own, they're just ignorant to the fact that it even exists. Or are they an arm of the prosecutor's office, and B, how do they work and what are they?
Okay, yes, in fact, they are an arm of the prosecutor's office. We have a full-time staff of people to deal just with victims and witnesses, to go from the simplest thing to provide transportation, for example, to go much beyond that, maybe to find a home for a battered woman who was the victim of a physical or a sexual assault, to provide services for children, to get them in touch with the Violent Crimes Compensation Board to explain their rights. We walk through victims, especially infants, through an actual court situation so that they can see what they're going to face at the time they actually have to face trial. It was something that was sorely lacking in the criminal justice system. The system was enforcement oriented for many, many years. And just in the last several years has this program really taken off. And we find that it's had a tremendous effect in Ocean. I know John feels the same way in Monmouth.
It helps us with our cases.
Clearly.
I mean, there's a dramatic difference in satisfaction that people feel. You know, even if you lose a case, which happens every now and then. I mean, we lose a prosecution. But the victims know that we're in there with them, trying to help them every way they can. They really get treated like they deserve. They get some empathy and some help.
I've found that a lot of people, especially victims, are just very confused about the whole process. And that's why we were talking about the municipal courts as opposed to the county courts. They get a subpoena or they get a letter even from the Victim Witness Assistance Program, and they just don't understand what it's about. And very often in years past, before the Victim Witness Program blossomed, so to speak, we get calls regularly. What happened to my case? What happened to this? I went to court. What can you tell me? Then they go to grand jury and get one of those. You can't talk to anybody, so they'll be afraid to call you to ask you what you said. And I've found that it's a great boon, so to speak, to our relationship with the public. By the same token, people, because of the officiality of forms that they get when they get something from Victim Witness Assistance, or I don't know whether it has a prosecutor's letterhead on it. I
well,
believe
it does.
It might.
In my office does.
Sometimes they get intimidated, and that's why I wanted to bring it up now, just that that's a system set up to help them instead of...
yeah, but you know, you don't, just one little counterweight to that, we don't satisfy every victim, you know. Most of them are very pleased with the efforts, but you may have a few calling right now who think that we didn't give them such a good deal. And those are usually the ones where that Terry alluded to before, where we may remand a case instead of continuing with an indictment on an upper level. Certain people come to expect occasionally too much from the criminal justice system. We can only do so much. We can only prove so much, and we can only expect so much. So one of the things is we try to make realistic projections of what are going to happen to these cases. That helps us with the relationships that victim-witness develops, so that they can also help explain it to people, perhaps in non-lawyer type words. I mean, we're all guilty of talking like lawyers. They say nobody understands us.
Keeping with what Prosecutor Kaye said, some people don't understand the difference between the criminal justice system and the civil justice system. And very often business people will wrongfully believe that we're a collection agency for them in any kind of business dispute that they have. And clearly we're not. We're not set up to do that. And that's the purpose of the civil court. So we run into that, and as Prosecutor Kaye has said, we don't satisfy everybody. Those are the type of people that often we don't satisfy because they don't understand. But I think it's important, and I know he does in his office as we do in ours, is we try to give people the time to explain to them why we're doing it. And I certainly have found that in the past, that one of the biggest problems that lawyers, be they prosecutors or in private practice, is that they don't explain in simple enough terms to the general public what's going on. And if you have people like the victim witness coordinators who can sit down with the people and explain to lay people in lay terms what's going on, it certainly takes away a lot of burden from us and certainly from the law enforcement community as a whole.
It certainly does. I've found that especially youthful victims, and mostly in the sexual or physical abuse areas, but more in the sexual abuse areas, where someone is charged, very often, understandably, they get worked up about having to go to court, but very often they, because of the job that maybe the police together with the prosecutor do, and the victim witness area in preparing the people, don't you find a lot of them don't even ever get to court? The people plead because the stigma of having to get up in front of a bunch of people and be pointed out by a victim as doing these horrid things is more than they really want to deal with. Do you find...
Well, of course it happens.
Yeah, well, the overwhelming amount of our cases plead in both counties. With all our lawyers, I think last year, in Monmouth County, we only completed about 300 trials. That doesn't sound like much. We had over 10,000 incidents reported to us and like 3,500 indictments of adults, not counting 1,500 juvenile matters. So, 300 trials, that sounds like a very little amount, but you got to remember we've only got 3 judges sitting. I mean, how many cases can you have? So if we dispose of all those cases, and we do dispose of most of them in a year, we're not doing it by trying them.
Absolutely.
So the key to most of it is the police work is so excellent and so good these days. I mean, it's just, when I started practicing law 20 years ago, there's no comparison to what today's police officer can do with the education and training he has. So that by the time we get the case, the odds are the person's guilty anyway. So they know they're guilty, and we've got the evidence to prove they're guilty. Now the question is, how do you work this out to satisfy the victim, to get what the state deserves as a punishment, and to do what's right by all the parties? And we do. We work that out.
A lot of people, I think, get disturbed, I guess is the word, victim-wise, or people that are just maybe involved in a case and get a letter from victim witness assistance that says, thank you for your help in this trial. Johnny Bag of Donuts was charged with 57 counts, and he pled guilty to 3 of them. I understand why 3 is still a pretty good number from 57, but maybe the people don't. Do you just kind of randomly pick, and say, we'll throw this out, or is there a real...
Well, we have a regular written procedure, and I know Ocean does too, so that the defense lawyers come in, they can see what they're facing. What we try to do is anticipate what the sentence would be, regardless of the fact that there may be 57 different counts. We know that the judges are going to look at a lot of concurrent sentences. They're going to look at the background of the person. So we try to anticipate how many years, or maybe not years, what is the punishment going to be? And whether it's 3 counts or 57, it's the end that counts. It's the final result that counts. And if there's a problem, I mean, if the guy breaks out of prison or he violates the term and condition, you know, we start all over again. We find that the justice system, oddly enough, works quite well. And plea bargaining, as it's called, is no bargain. I mean, it's no bargain.
Not when you come to Ocean County and if you distribute drugs and I tell your lawyer, I don't care whether it was 1 roach or 10 kilos, he's going to do some time in jail because that's our policy. That's not a bargain. There's no such thing as a bargain when you're going to the county jail or to a state prison because they certainly are no bargains.
Absolutely. I don't even like dropping people off there.
I understand what you mean.
Kevin, we have in a second to make an aside to pick up on something that Prosecutor Kaye said. He mentioned the difference in law enforcement in the 20 years since he's been practicing and I've been practicing. Absolutely incredible difference. And I think a lot of that today is reflected from the prosecutor's offices throughout the state and the Attorney General's office. They all have educational committees, the Prosecutors Association and the Attorney General's office, and we're getting the information and we're getting the training out to the officers in the field. More money is probably spent today on outside educational programs for law enforcement officers than was spent 20 years ago in the entire educational process from day one at the so-called boot camp that you guys all went to. And I think that's really critical. We're getting better trained officers, better educated officers, and of course that makes our job ultimately that much easier, as the prosecutor indicated, that when we have a case that we can sit down across the table with a defense attorney, he can make his spiel, but the bottom line is, here's my investigation. I have to cover 5 points, all 5 points are covered, it's done. Now, let's talk about being realistic. How much time is your client really facing here? What are the good points in your client? What are the bad points? And now let's reach an ultimate conclusion. That's what plea bargaining bottom line is. But it's there because we can depend today on having educated, reliable law enforcement personnel, and we certainly do in both of our counties. And I know John's as proud of his people as we are of ours.
Oh, yeah.
Well, both counties have their own police academy.
Correct.
And I know Monmouth County just built a new facility, and I had the pleasure of instructing in there.
We spend a lot of time with the prosecutors in both counties going out to both of those academies and teaching the local officers as well as our own. I'm involved in training programs literally myself on a weekly basis.
We have just a minute or so left this evening. Maybe both of you could take a short amount of time and sum up. Just give us maybe an idea where you think law enforcement's going in Monmouth and Ocean County in the next several years, maybe even tomorrow.
Well, I'll just make one generalized observation, and I guess it goes back to the historical thing. I think that law enforcement is becoming more of a choice career. When I was in college and in law school, a police officer was a pig, and there was a tremendous amount of animosity towards the police. Now it's attracting people who could go into many other careers. I hired a CPA the other day to work as an investigator in my office. And I think that you're going to find just a increasing level of professionalism in law enforcement for the rest of this century.
There was a time that law enforcement had to be dragged into the current century. Now they're leaping into the 20th century.
On that thought, I think that's all the time we have. I'd like to thank our guests for coming. I really appreciate it. And Mr. Kaye and Mr. Farley, you've been a great help in setting up this show. This is the first one, so we're giving it our best shot. Tune in on the 15th of September, Thursday at 9 p.m. when I'll have the guests from the Monmouth and Ocean County Chiefs of Police Association who will be speaking about their view on law enforcement, which is very similar to the prosecutors, and won't disagree at all in any of the things. Thank you for your time.